And what did you start working with at that time?
So I ended up having a similar role as Johan. So we were two of us having this like special projects role. So helping out with whatever things that Daniel and the management team needed help with. But very early on, when I approached running some kind of project with them, for them, I said, well, then to make this decision, we need to have data, right? And then we saw that, well, wait, we don't have any data. There is very little data here to work with, and there is no team that I can work with who can actually provide me with this data. So at that time, I said, I think you need to build a data team to Daniel. And then in true startup sense, he said, that's a good idea. Why don't you build that for me?
Is this pre the famous server? Is this pre the first Horton cluster?
No, so this is pre, or this is during, I would say. Because the good thing about that time was that we had great developers, right? Who all of them were like eager to try out the latest and greatest in tech. So some people had already picked this Hadoop, the technology.
Hadoop, sorry, no, it was a pure Hadoop.
The closet.
Exactly. The Hadoop in the closet. It was not Horton. Sorry, not Horton.
Exactly.
The Hadoop in the closet.
Horton came later, actually.
Exactly. No, so we had great people in the team that had picked that technology already and started playing with it. So that was like a few people who were involved in that. So I kind of tried to put them all together and make this into a bit more structured organization, and then staff it up with more people on the tech side, but also on the analytics side, so who could actually analyze this data and make better decisions out of it. Basically what we said we need for the politicians, right?
So I saw on your LinkedIn profile, Vice President Analytics.
Right.
So that was, go and do something, Daniel said. Why don't you fix the data then if you want analysis?
Yeah, exactly.
You become VP yourself. You become VP Analytics.
That's exactly how it works.
And how was that? How did you interpret that role at that point in time, or how would you look at your OKRs back? What were they? In the beginning it was, we were very early on to start to explore how can we work with this data? How can we make better decisions with all this amount of data? We were early on to have all these different events, but basically you can say like every click of every user in a data set. That's an enormous amount of data that no one had actually looked at before. So in the beginning it was just like helping out to figure out, make sure that we have that data available, like just having that. And I remember it didn't mostly work at all. So we had to do a lot of work, or the developers to. But can you remember what were the first questions that you wanted to have answered? What's the insights or decisions that you wanted to support?
Yeah.
What was your first use case?
One of the very first one was it was at the time when it was a lot of debate on how to restrict Spotify because this was linked to label discussions where they wanted to enforce different types of restrictions. So and eventually it led up to us having to say that every user can only play one track on the free side for 5 times ever. After that, it should be like blocked and you cannot play the same song again. Super complex and cumbersome thing to implement, and also for the users, really, really awful. But that actually did happen. But before that, it was a lot of analysis around that. So how can we make if we are about to create restrictions, what should we do?
And this was the record labels that had crazy ideas in the beginning before they understood where this was going.
Exactly, because at that time the power balance was very different, right? But then since we had that data, of course, we wanted them to how can we use this data to understand and get informed in that decision? How can we simulate that? So together with Erik Bernhardsson, we did a lot of great work to simulate this. I remember we called it the snowball analysis. So what if, looking into how people's behaviors were at that time, how many times do you listen to a track? How many would hit the cap? And what do we believe about their churn probabilities afterwards? And what will that lead to? If we have the cap at 5 or at 10 or 20 or in hours, playing out with different scenarios like that. That was one of the first things we tried.
Super cool.
And you continue to grow that for some time, and you built a graph team as well, which I...
Oh, right.
Yeah. You forgot about that. And so many more things. And if like big highlights that you would like to mention perhaps during your Spotify years?
There are so many. But I think in general, just seeing how this new ability that we could see so much and we could simulate at this level that I just mentioned everywhere, and see how that transformed the way we worked in all the different functions. So now we talked about how to simulate those possible limitations using customer behavior, but then thinking about the same we did for doing marketing. We were super early on to do performance marketing, right? And it's the same philosophy we apply there too. So, okay, we can actually see which users that we pay for, that when they come in, what do they do? What's the value of that? And we could get much more granular in that. And it's so cool to see how that transformed everything we did and made us much better in like a general decision making. And then also the psychological aspect of that. So how that changed how people work, how they view themselves and how they should view their own views of how the world works. For example, I remember some people in the design team, first time we talked to them about like, okay, you have built a great design here, but actually we've seen in data that people react in this way. So maybe we could try something like this. And the immediate reaction for someone who's never use data like that is like, well, I know how this works. Don't come to me and tell me how users think here. I know how this works. And then seeing how we got from that point to actually getting data as a very natural part of even the designer's toolkit, and how that made them even better, right? Same with everywhere. I think that was a big takeaway for myself that still holds. And I think it's still also, going back to the politicians, something that they will need to go through if they are ever going to be really data.
But you're hitting a really raw nerve in a good way now, because when you're driving and explaining your big highlight, like one of the key highlights. I mean, like Spotify in many ways in Sweden is one of the real poster childs of how would you define a data-driven business in Sweden. And everybody looks up to Spotify and forgets you started from scratch in thinking about data as well. Yeah. You happen to be part of that process. Yeah. Now, could you reflect if there were some instrumental moments or instrumental moves you did that made this happen or accelerated your data-driven, that this took on? Because it could have been just another project and then, that's not really cool, we do something else. Yeah. So why did it stick? Could you reflect on that, those instrumental moments that makes the data-driven mindset stick? What did you do that...
I mean, the first thing I think was that we did manage to get all of that data as a first place. We could, and not everyone can, right?
But you worked really hard, struggling to get the data.
And that was thanks to I think it all started with a very complex reporting needs of Spotify, that we had to report every stream. We had logic that actually was depending on, like, to figure out how much money everyone should get, you had to actually look at every single stream. So we had to already very early on find solutions for how can we actually calculate that. And this was before my time in the beginning. But I think that was
that is actually meaning that to some degree have a grip on data for the core business model. It was ingrained in the core culture and business model early on. That's a problem for many, that they don't have that.
Yeah, no, I think maybe the culture, the general data-driven culture, probably came later when we started to use that data for business decisions. But we couldn't get there unless we had we had the ability to store all the data, and we couldn't get there unless we started, I think, by these complex reporting requirements that forced us to use this technology that allowed us to store all the things. It helped us to get very early on in that.
Really good point.
But I think the other thing is to, I think this initiative to start the analytics team that Daniel asked me, or I asked him and he asked me back. I think it was a crucial point to get that centralized early on. in the journey.
And the really top support.
Really top support.
Real top support.
I was reporting to Daniel Ek as this head of analytics for several years in the beginning, and I think very few companies have done that. And that made it very centralized, right? So in all the different management meetings, I was there. I was like all the time trying to think about how can we get data on what we're discussing right now.
So not stack 3 layers down, 5 layers down.
Exactly. So I think that was very important.
So you could then indoctrinate the data agenda in the real meetings.
Yeah, exactly. And after meetings, like taking people aside and like maybe I have some ideas where maybe we can find something in what we were discussing. And then you had relationships.
You had the network.
And the context of the important questions that really matters for the company right now. Because sitting with all this data and just sifting through and create analysis and graphs that no one uses, that's a recipe for disaster. So it has to be connected to what really matters for the company. And to get that, you need to bring data to those questions.